Today, I'm talking to Taj Ali, co-editor of Tribune Magazine and historian of South Asian political activism. During the recent racist rioting in the UK, he found himself at the centre of a countrywide communications network, in touch with Muslim communities, migrant communities from all around the UK, amplifying call-outs for solidarity and counter-demonstrations, and also monitoring the far right. I'd say he's got a pretty unique perspective on what happened and also what should happen next. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Taj Ali, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So my first question, and I don't mean this in a where were you between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. kind of way. It's just to familiarise our audience with your work, is what were you doing during the riots?
I was getting constant messages, particularly from British Muslims, from Black and Asian people across the country. Being one of the few Muslim journalists in the media profession from a working class background, I come from Luton. A lot of people reached out to me with messages. It was relentless. There's been an Islamophobic attack here. We've heard that the far right are mobilising here. We need numbers in this particular place. And I was just sharing information on Twitter. I was also liaising with trade unionists, liaising with local Muslims up and down the country, and just making sure we had some sort of protection in different parts of the country. I wasn't sleeping properly. I barely got a wink for like 3 or 4 days. And that was my role, was just constantly sharing information, text messages, WhatsApps, Twitter messages from random people, but also trying to verify it, which is always extremely difficult because misinformation can be deadly. Misinformation can cause people to mobilize in large numbers when there's perhaps no far-right threat. And the BNP used to deliberately do this back in the day to get us riled up. And so it's a difficult balancing act between trying to stay vigilant against a far-right threat while also not being duped and not being allowed to live in fear.
From my perspective, it seemed that your job was to be at the centre of this communication network when you were pulling together reports of far-right mobilisations, reports of attacks on mosques, sharing call-outs for counter-demonstrators. But also, were you monitoring the far right at all in terms of what they were saying?
Absolutely. And I've been monitoring them for years because we have Telegram chats where the far right were whipping up this moral panic, especially patriotic alternative around asylum seekers in hotels. In Dunstable near me, we used to have a big far right problem. And they did this with one of the hotels that used to be booked for weddings. And so we were keeping tabs on them. We were trying to figure out where they would go. But also, you just need to look at where Reform were doing very well in the general election. And that tells you a story. A lot of people did not pick this up. But in former mining communities, in former, seaside towns that once used to be thriving, the far right have been building their presence there. And we always knew that there would be a threat there. We were seeing what was happening in Dublin in Ireland around refugees. And what we found was it's in areas where the Muslim community are small in number. These are the places that will be targeted. A lot of these places are very deprived. And those were the places where Muslims were absolutely terrified. I mean, I had one individual get in touch to say he was in Bishop Auckland and he said, I've shut the shop. My wife's having panic attacks. We're just going to pray that we're okay. And straight away I said, listen, what's happening in Bishop Auckland? Do we have any people around there? Even one of the people involved in the far right protest got in touch, said, we're not going to attack these businesses, and provided reassurances. But that was the kind of threat level that people were facing. And you have to remember, these people are cowards. They target Muslim women, hijab-wearing Muslim women in particular, where they are isolated. Some of the things I was hearing from Belfast, where the Muslim community live in the loyalist areas, were horrific. Islamophobic hate crimes, attacks on shops, trying to burn down shops. And it's all well and good having big numbers and mobilising in Luton and Birmingham and Bradford. But the real threat was in the North East and Merseyside in particular. And that's the areas I was focused on in particular, making sure, trade unionists were going down, the Fire Brigades Union, the RMT Union, CWU Union. They were mobilising
the biggest people. Lads. We need the unions with the biggest lads.
Unfortunately, we went to Dunstable the other week.
There's a reason why you weren't getting in touch with the NUJ. We're like, your digital content producers are not needed.
But there's a serious point to be made around self-defense, because we had some really fantastic activists who went to Dunstable and did a rally because there was meant to be a far-right presence. They're not going to defend a mosque, but they're good people. And so we also needed the other people who were capable of giving the far-right a fright. And I took a friend down who Tommy Robinson used to run away from. And it was just me and him and a group of people from Dunstable. It was just one individual turned up and he said, "Oh, you fell for it. You fell for my trap." And we just laughed at him and said, "We're still going to be here." You know, we had WhatsApp groups in Luton and Dunstable where they were, monitoring the communities, patrolling the streets. I spoke to the taxi drivers from Luton who sometimes drive in Dunstable. They felt quite safe. So it depends where you are in the country, and that's where the threat level was in the northeast and Merseyside in particular.
I mean, I think what you say about the threat level being different is so true. I mean, I was going through Whitechapel at the time, and it was just very obvious that the local Muslim community had organised some spotters, and they were standing like at the tube station and giving people a bit of a look, but they weren't going to go there. I mean, where I live is Tottenham, and
no way are they going Tottenham.
I was like hearing people being like, "I wish they'd come here." Like, I wish they'd come here. And on the one hand, there's an element of pride in that. You feel very proud of your community, but on the other, there was a feeling of, I'm so far away from the communities that are vulnerable. Geographically, I'm far away from the communities that are vulnerable, but also experientially, I'm really far away from the communities that are vulnerable. And was that something that you were detecting when you were looking at where the left was and where the left was able to mobilise and where you were seeing the threat was coming from?
I think there's a very serious problem here, and it's multifaceted, with the left in general being so distant from working class communities in these places. Walthamstow, we saw a massive turnout. I also had a Bengali friend saying there were people there with beers in their hand thinking this is a bit of a party, right? And I find that personally quite disrespectful, given that we have hijab wearing women in fear. I get it, there's no real threat in London, and good on people for turning up and showing what they stand for. But it was a different experience depending on who you are. There is no massive far-right threat in London. Perhaps in Dagenham and other places, it's worth monitoring because of the history, right? But what we should have been doing is reaching out to the communities outside of London and saying, "Do you need us to come up?" And that's what we were doing. We spoke to one of the youth workers in Middlesbrough and we said, "We're ready to come up." And he said, "No, we've got it under control. Some of our kids are MMA fighters." Seriously. But the thing is, I shared this video of someone involved in one of the mosques in Middlesbrough who I was liaising with on a story, and he gave a speech and he said, "We're just here to protect our mosques and our community and our businesses, and that's it. Let the police carry on with their jobs." Why? Because he didn't want his youngsters arrested. I think that's a very sensible and practical way of doing self-defense. And if you study the history of anti-racism in this country, it was never vigilantism. It was organized self-defense. A key part of it was monitoring. In Sheffield, the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement, they had a thick folder called the Fascist File, right? They had a house called the Bus Shelter, codenamed. They did the work. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about understanding the threat, mapping it out, figuring out who the key individuals are. That takes a lot of effort. You don't do that by tweeting online. You do that by doing the work.
Not too loud about tweeting online now. I want to go back to the events leading up to the riots and talking about Southport in particular. How did Southport become the catalysing event for everything that we saw?
Well, it was clearly misinformation about the perpetrator of the attack, right? And we've seen misinformation about the Muslim community in this country for years. What I didn't like was how people allowed the trigger factor to explain everything. When you study history, the trigger often masks the long-term causes. And I believe if you look at the rhetoric we were seeing since what happened in Gaza, right? You had Suella Braverman coming out saying, you've got these hate marches on the streets. You had this whole moral panic around Islamists taking over the country. You even had Labour figures, playing into that narrative around intimidation. And, we always made clear there's no need for intimidation and abuse, but we are allowed to hold you to account. We send you to Westminster, not the other way around. But they all played a role. After those elections, you saw, Jonathan Ashworth, I'm not sure. Every day he's on the telly somewhere. It's like he's haunting us, right?
It's like, the Jennifer Lopez Get Right video where everyone in the club is J-Lo. That's how I feel with Jonathan Ashworth at the moment. I feel like I'm going to walk in the club, the bartender's Jonathan Ashworth, the DJ's Jonathan Ashworth.
Yeah, it's like something from Black Mirror. And it's partly because, he's very close with the lobby journalists. They were on the battle bus or whatever it's called, right? And they maintain good relations. That's another problem, right? These people are all in Westminster. They don't understand our communities. When Muslims are angry about Gaza, they come to us, give us your contacts. Let's speak to people on the ground. When we're being attacked on the street, suddenly they all want to know who we are, right? But they don't care about us when we talk about housing or the cost of living or anything else. But, going back to the point, I think when it comes to the left in the metropolitan cities, right, we've always had this thing around very wealthy people being part of the left. Tony Benn, one of my heroes, his class background was clearly not mine, and he played a role. But the problem is we have too many people who are so divorced from the experiences of working class people that they project onto them what they think are their values as well. And let me tell you something, British Muslims and ethnic minority communities are not very, very socially liberal. There are many, especially young boys. I went back to my former high school, Chorney Boys. I went to State Comprehensive, 99% black and Asian. There was only one white person in the entire year group. Even he was Irish, right? And I used to look up to Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, and that was seen as cool. All of these kids were listening to Andrew Tate. He'd become Muslim as well. And they were being radicalized. They had this whole thing about liberalism and feminism is a threat, right? Men can't be men anymore. They want to make us weak. And I think when Andrew Tate played a role in some of the misinformation, a lot of Muslims were like, okay, this man's not our friend. But my point is there is a gender issue here as well. Young boys are turning to these individuals. A lot of the kids that were rioting, they are kids, they're white working class kids in really poor parts of the country. Of course, you had the neo-Nazis, and you had the Patriotic Alternative, and you had Tommy's old crew. But a lot of them were kids being radicalized. And I think that's a very serious problem that the left has not taken seriously.
I mean, you say distance from working class communities. And I suppose one of the things that I'm curious about is, do you mean that geographically, or do you mean that even within the same geographic location? Because obviously in London, London is a city of the working poor. Look at Tower Hamlets, look at Tottenham, look at Lambeth or wherever. But there is a sense of you can live in the same place but live on different planets.
Exactly that. And look, this is the thing. When I talk about class, I always say the working class are multiracial and multi-faith, right? I always say, Bethnal Green, Birmingham, Bradford, it's not too different from Barnsley and Middlesbrough and Sunderland. I've always made that point. But even in East London, right, I was told there was meant to be some sort of event around anti-racism. Only 6 Bengalis turned up, and you've got East London Mosque around the corner where they can mobilize thousands. Clearly, there's a disconnect there, right? And, no one expects you to have all the links in the community. But I think there needs to be an appreciation for the fact that people have different views. We on the left sometimes allow a disagreement in terms of tactics to morph into something bigger, right? You're not pure enough to be part of the left because you advocated this. You don't believe in this, so you must be on their side. You must be a cop lover or a fascist or all the rest of it. Are we trying to build a mass movement here? Are we trying to make people's lives better? Or are we just trying to feel good about ourselves and move on, I
mean, to take it back to the riots, I mean, one of the pieces of footage which really not only disturbed me, but let me know that something completely different from what we've seen before is going on, right? And it's different from the 2011 riots, right? This is different. Was when in Middlesbrough, you had young guys, kids, a lot of them, going down a residential street, bricking in windows, kicking in doors. That was not something you saw in the 2011 riots, was attack on residential properties, right? In the same way. So from your perspective, how did things end up that way, where you've got a mob not just targeting businesses, not just targeting what they consider to be politicized targets like hotels where asylum seekers are, but targeting residential properties?
I think people who believe in violence, right? People who believe that they can attack others, right? They feel they have nothing to lose, right? I'm not making excuses for them. If they had attacked my house or my business, I'd be absolutely furious. But what I'm saying is these are vulnerable individuals who've been brainwashed, right, to think someone like me is completely alien to them, that I'm a threat to them, that I'm a violent extremist. And what we saw in those places even parents were bringing their kids out, right? In Birmingham, when the kids were agitated and angry, right? And I thought, okay, look, GB News are licking their lips here. They're going to get their clips out of this and some of our brothers might be arrested. A lot of the elders were saying, maintain calm, you're only here to defend your community and that's it.
Well, being
right?
parents.
Yeah, right? And even the pub, they thought that the EDL were in one of the pubs, right? And so they went in there. And some of the elders went back into that pub and said, these lot are kids. They don't represent us and we're sorry, right? In Accrington, when the Muslims came out to defend the community, the pub goers came and gave them a hug. And I think there's a real danger here where you've got individuals, right? You have to remember it's summer, school's out, right? And you've got individuals who've got nothing going for them, who've been told that, these Muslims and these migrants and these refugees are a problem. And they're going to go ahead with those acts of violence. It's the same with gang culture, right? With gang culture, you feel a sense of community and family and purpose and cause. There are, with football hooliganism as well, people loved to have a fight. They enjoyed it. Some of them really enjoy it. Violence. They feel some sense of fulfillment from it.
Oh, it's a thrill.
Yeah. And I think I understand it in that sense as well. It's interesting because I've also been told there were small business owners involved in the rioting. They're not poor. They've got businesses. They've got a bit of money. Why are they getting involved? That's a deeper thing there. And I think it's racism. It's dehumanization of the other. And for me, it's constantly been this thing of division, right? You're helping them, but you're not helping us. And I think the trade union movement has always had this conception of, the working class, get them in a union and organize. A lot of people are not in unions. They're self-employed.
Yeah.
They're in the private sector and 12% union density in the private sector? Where is the left when it comes to self-employed people? The far right are trying to target them. The far right are trying to say, you're getting taxed too much. And all these migrants are coming in and there's not enough housing for the rest of us. And they've not integrated and they're a threat to our women and things like that. And suddenly you've got a moral panic on your hands because a lot of those people are never sitting down for a coffee with people like me.
I mean, let's talk about this then, the sort of composition of rioters, because obviously now we're seeing the sentencing, you can get a good sense of who people are. And so you've got teenagers and you've got kids and you've got, kids who I imagine maybe also didn't come from the most stable backgrounds because they don't have a mum being like, fuck, are you going out
Yeah,
there?
exactly.
Right? Because that's what an on-the-ball parent would do, which is like, I am locking you up until this is over. Right? So you've got kids who, for me, looked like they were just in it for the thrill, a lot of them. And they might be ambiently racist. They might use words like packy and other things at school, but I don't think they're that ideological. You had people who were habitual offenders, no fixed abode. That's coming up a lot in court. So people who are, for all intents and purposes, homeless or precariously housed, not in employment, have been in prison before, maybe have had substance abuse problems, really, really are the definition of nothing to lose, right? They've got nothing, so what's there to lose? And when it comes to kids and, the no fixed abode lot, I go, well, this makes sense to me, right? You've got nothing to lose and maybe your inhibitions aren't very good because you're literally like 14. My inhibitions weren't very good when I was 14. Terrible judgment. And then you've got, what you'd call the petty bourgeois, small business owners, self-employed, tradespeople, probably own a house, maybe even own two, have at least one car, doing all right for themselves, right? So, you're doing all right. They very much have something to lose. And, those are the people who are crying in court now because, they're going to lose their businesses. How do they get to the point from being, sure, radicalized on the issue of immigration and asylum, but getting to the point where they go, I'm going to risk it all for this thing? That's the sort of bit I don't get. Do you have any insights about it?
I think it's partly individualism, isn't it? It's this idea that I need to look out for myself and, we need to send them a message because we're not being listened to. And again, the role of the media, constantly seeing those Daily Mail and Sun headlines for years and years and years, watching GB News, right? And all of these things play a role. When you've got Farage on telly saying British Muslims don't have British values, right? This guy's one of the most popular politicians in
have
Britain.
you seen us? We queue.
We try to. But, he's got a platform. He's been on the BBC so many times, right? And we always treat this as legitimate concerns. I had people message me on Twitter who said, we think immigration's out of control. We think grooming gangs have been covered up, but we are completely against the rioting because they're also impacting our businesses as well. They're smashing up our own communities. And we would like to have a dialogue. And I said, I'd love to have a dialogue. Right now, I'm trying to make sure my sisters are safe, right? And so what I also noticed was there was a bit of a splintering of the far right. There were people who were saying, this has gone a bit too far, I think. The mindset of an individual who's doing well for himself, right? And he decides that, let me go and target a shop or a business or anything like that. I think that's just ridiculous behavior. There's no excuse for it. I worked in a taxi base when I was in college, right? In the heart of Luton. And there was a drunk guy came in once and he called me the P word, right? And he felt emboldened to say it because he'd had his drink, right? And people sometimes say to me, they were drunk though. And I was like, so? When you're drunk,
I get drunk.
Yeah.
I haven't racially abused anyone.
Exactly. I mean, what kind of excuse is that? But also, what we saw then with the rioting was it allowed the closet racist to become comfortable. Now I can say the P word. Now, before I used to just give you a look on public transport. Now I can actually say how I feel, right? I'm not going to get cancelled anymore because this is everywhere. And that's what we saw happening. Even in Luton, there were attacks on hijab-wearing women. Even with our big community, there were isolated attacks in the early morning, right? Individuals feeling opportunistic. That's a serious problem. We have an atmosphere of hate in this country, and that is not going to go away with a few rallies in metropolitan cities, because we know there are many progressive people in this country. They already agree with us. So, what are we trying to achieve here? And I think what the left should be doing is we should be in Middlesbrough. We should be in Merseyside. We should be facilitating dialogue and discussion and having conversations. And there are some great people in Newcastle who do work with the food banks on the football terraces. Ian Byrne in Liverpool, what a legend.
Yeah, he was a big part of the fan supporting food banks effort, which is both Everton and Liverpool.
Exactly that. And he is probably one of the most humble people I know. As soon as I posted about a racist attack in Liverpool, he messaged me and said, give me the details, I'll look into it. I hope you're well, checking up on me. This guy doesn't have a big Muslim community in his constituency, but for years and years he has consistently spoken up against Islamophobia, including within his own party.
So I spoke to Dan Evans about this quite a while back. So this was, I think, last autumn. And one of the things he said is that when there is far-right rioting or an attack on an asylum centre, the left always goes, well, we have to go organise in Knowsley. Or we've got to go organise in Middlesbrough. We've got to go organise in Hull. The left doesn't live in Knowsley, and it doesn't live in Hull, and it doesn't live in Middlesbrough. So what would your response be to someone who's saying, well, sure, you're saying the left needs to be in these places, but we don't live there?
It depends how you define the left, right? I have connections in Middlesbrough. I know one of the youth workers. I've known him for years. He does a lot of work to help the kids there, the Asian kids. The MP is Andy MacDonald. He's a good friend of us. And so what we would say is facilitate it. Let local people take the lead, but at least initiate things, right? So what I propose to the folk in Middlesbrough is we will get trade unionists down. We will get people down to help facilitate. Let's book out a community centre. You let us know how you want to do it. Let's get an imam on the panel. Let's find out who the key folk are in the white working class parts of the town and invite them in, because there will be people that want to have a frank discussion. That's how it's got to be. Not you going in and saying, I'm here to save you, but you doing what you can to facilitate things, to bring people together. If you've got the connections with the trade union movement, if you've got a connection with people who work on the football terraces, a lot of what I was doing on Twitter was call-outs. And a lot of the people that came out to support were white people who were saying, this is horrible, right? And I'm connected to this person. I'll monitor this part. Bishop Auckland, the next day, that individual I told you about, someone messaged me and said, I'm here and I'm monitoring, and I'll let you know if I see anything. There are a lot of good people in our communities. A lot of them don't call themselves socialists or on the left. And I think that's the mindset we need to have. I tend not to talk about the left needs to do this, or I tend to talk about communities and class and individuals, because I think when you start to use being on the left or socialism or communism as an identity becomes a problem, because most people do not subscribe to labels like that.
Most people aren't ideological, and it's not part of their identity.
Yeah, and I went to Warwick, and when I went there were a lot of people very wealthy who would talk about the working class need to do this and the working class need to do that. And I said, you guys would never convince anyone in my town, right? Nobody would come to your meetings and whatever. If, what we also have in Luton, we organise on a council estate called Marsh Farm. And we had riots in 95 where the police beat up a black kid, 3 days of riots. And some of the guys on the estate, they used to organise illegal raves in warehouses outside of Luton, just towards Dunstable. The Exodus Collective, they were called. And they did that on one night, and they got all the kids off the estate, and they went and they did their raving or whatever. And the police officer came and said, I could hear the birds whistling. There was no rioting. And the point is, through music and through food and all the rest of it, they were able to reach these people. And they also had the politics, because the politics came when people were clamping down on the sound system culture, right? And so this is a predominantly West Indian and white estate in Luton. We organise our Luton Tribune meetings there. We've got a group of 85 people. A lot of them would never come to things. But because we are present in the community and because we coordinate with, a lot of the West Indian groups, a lot of the Asian, we've got a very diverse working class group here. We tried the same in Toxteth. There's some fantastic individuals doing work in Toxteth, Somalis, Yemenis, and all the rest, and we've got a Tribune group there. And so that's the kind of work we're doing. It's hard. It's not easy. Like, you've got to put the effort in. You've got to figure out who the right people are, but it can be done, right?
And I guess you're working uphill against atomization, right? Communities are getting more atomized rather than less atomized, and that's because of housing prices, but it's also to do with lifestyle, right? So if, third spaces are being closed down everywhere in your neighborhood, and you've got your house, your car, and your workplace, and that's your sort of triangle of habits, like, where are the opportunities to connect? And you're having to work against that.
I think also the left has changed significantly, because what you used to have was a very strong trade union movement, and a lot of towns were built around the industries, particularly mining, right? And there was a sense of pride in your community, right? If I did a piece on Rugeley, which has a massive Amazon warehouse that's now closed down, and it was built on the site of a former coal pit. And when I went there to interview an Amazon worker, he said, my dad used to work here as a miner. And he said, there's nothing here for us. All the kids are leaving Rugeley because there's no sense of pride in the community. This is part of the reason, I think, when we were talking earlier about what would possess the mind of someone who riots and acts violently in their own community. They have no pride in their community. They have no sense of belonging, right? Luton, whenever I go to a middle class, Luton's a shithole. Oh, it's rubbish. What have you got? It's not great. There's not much there, and it's very deprived. We have one of the highest rates of child poverty and homelessness in the country. But there is a sense of community, right? When you go to Bury Park, which is the heart of the Asian community, that's where Kenilworth Road football ground is, right? I love walking through it.
I don't want to hear about other football teams. I don't want to hear about other football teams. I don't believe in pluralism like that, right?
But, you walk through it and there's problems, right? You can have, it's hard to walk through sometimes, right? But we've created this, thriving local businesses there, right? You can get anything you want. You can have the most amazing food. It's a poor area, but we have a sense of community. We would never target our own shops. We would never riot. We would never, mess around in that area where our uncles and aunts are walking. And I think that's very, very important. The left needs to have a concept around pride. I don't think we should give the far right the opportunity to take those things away from us.
Well, I mean, I want to discuss this just a little bit more because I think this has got the ring of truth to it, which is I'm very proud of the area where I'm from, right? And I talk about it like it's heaven on earth, all right? It's Tottenham. It's not heaven on earth, but, I feel very, very proud of it. And sometimes when I talk to people who come from other parts of the country, they'll say, yeah, where I'm from is a complete shithole. And it won't just be middle class people saying it like in a snobby way, like, oh, it's a shithole because it doesn't have a Girls Bakery. It will be working class people being like, I fucking hate this place. I fucking hate this place. And I couldn't wait to leave. And if that's how you feel about the place where you were raised, and especially if you don't leave and you go, well, the people who get opportunities don't stick around, right? So it's just me who's been left here, and I'm made to feel like a fuck up, and I'm made to feel like I've got nothing of value to give. And the built environment around me is telling me how worthless I am all the time. I mean, it's a very basic point, but I just keep coming back to, if you're happy and you feel that you've got opportunities, you don't burn down the place where you live.
But this is exactly it. You know, when I went to Warwick, right, and, you know, there were a few kids, a lot of the Asian kids went to Russell Group. A lot of them dropped out, by the way, straight A kids, because they couldn't hack it. They couldn't hack the social setting. They never felt part of the area. And it's sad. These are really talented kids who didn't like university because of that aspect of it, right? And I meet people in Luton who say, yeah, this area is crap. There's nothing to do here. The shop, you can't buy decent clothes, and I want to get out. I want to go abroad. All sorts of things, right?
I want to go Dubai.
Yeah. That's the myth everyone's been fed these days. But, you know, when I go to parts of North London, right, and I see how people live, right, they're in the bookshops and they're having, you know, in their cafes, and there's a real sense of happiness and pride, right? And I get on the train and I head back to Leagrave station. So you've got Luton, then Leagrave, which is near some of the council estate. And so on our Thameslink train, you've got St Albans, Harpenden, all of that. You can just know where people are going to, you know, I do a little game where I'm like, okay, St Albans, KPIs, you know, you just hear them on the phone and you're like, okay, they're there. And then you'll see your people and we're always at the end, right? You only appreciate class when you see the difference. There's a lot of kids in Luton that don't leave the town and they're happy. Some of them work for their parents' businesses. Some of them are doing really bad things and all the rest of it, but they're happy in their community, right? And living out for a while, you know, changed my perspective on a lot of things. Meeting white working class people at university and realizing, actually, I've got more in common with them than I do with some of the private
Did it take leaving to feel like you loved it? Did it take leaving to look back on it in a different way?
Oh yeah, I mean I wanted to leave Luton, and then when I felt isolated in middle class settings, you know, the amount of love I get from people in Luton when I see them, and they're like, yeah, Tad, you're doing your journalism thing, you're writing the book, and there's a real sense of love, even people that barely know me. And you know, I had a friend who became a pilot, right? I was so happy for him. I was like, yeah, that's this guy I used to play football with. He's a pilot now. There was a real sense of pride. And we have this love because we grew up together for so long. We have this sense of community. We know each other. We know the shopkeepers. We know the local barbers. And we look out for each other. And the thing is, what people forget about Luton is a lot of white working class people oppose Tommy Robinson, right? He likes to claim that, you know, he speaks for white working class people. He doesn't. You know, they were on the front line. We have a massive Irish community. Tommy's Irish, right? They were on the front line. And so what the media did to my town is they just made money on it, right? Sensationalism. Stacey Dooley did her documentary, My Hometown Fanatics. I don't know if you've seen that one, where she comes to Luton and Al-Muhajirun are marching through Bury Park. I never see that, and I walk through that place all the time, right? So she picked a day when they're marching and she made it look like there's a big Muslim extremism problem. And then she spoke to Tommy Robinson, and it was just this whole thing about, you know, this is a community divided. These are people living parallel lives. And it sold, right? It was a story that the media lapped up. They don't want to speak to a white working class kid who's like, I think the EDL are full of shit. Why? Because that's not a story for them.
I mean, I completely agree with you on this idea of like the media have it in their head what the story is. And I mean, in various different ways, when I've tried to talk to lobby journalists and I've gone like, well, this thing isn't true. And or this thing is actually like just partial. And what about this? They go, well, that's not the story, right? It's a way in which they become invested in all going after the same thing. And no one wants to be the journalist who separates themselves from the herd, because then you don't have career prospects. But I do want to talk a little bit about this idea of parallel lives just a bit, because sure, like there is mixing, right? You can't stop people from mixing. You have to work really, really hard to stop people from mixing, right? Like you leave people to their own devices and they will. But the nature of work has changed, and this is particularly the case up north. So, you know, sure, it was like fucking back-breaking work, like in the factories, right? And, you know, the Pakistanis, the Kashmiris, they were brought over specifically to do night shifts in the factories. But you'd come into contact with other workers.
Yeah.
Now those factories are gone. And, well, where are you working? If you're working class and Asian and in that area, like driving taxis, that's a big one. Like running takeaways, that's another big one. You're not working in settings which are bringing you into contact with other people who from other backgrounds who are your colleagues.
But even when they worked in the factories and the foundries and the mills, they were also segregated, right? My dad said they used to call it the Paki shift when he did the night shift at Vauxhall. And so they segregated them. And if you look at the Imperial Typewriters strike in Leicester in 74, they had separated the workers, right? But then because they were a minority, they would automatically be mixing, right? Because white flight had not happened to that same, my road was mainly white, and we had West Indians and we had Irish people and all the rest. And, my West Indian neighbor, when he sees us doing well, he celebrates like we're his kids, right? But slowly it became overwhelmingly Asian, my part of Luton. And I think there was a problem around being segregated, but it was inevitable if you think about it, right? If you want a decent pub, are you going to live in an area where there's no pubs anymore and they've been converted to a shisha lounge or a mosque or a restaurant, whatever, right? If you want halal meat, why on earth are you going to live away from all the decent shops? So sometimes segregation can be quite natural. And I think what we need to do, I think through things like football, often people work together. When I worked in the cab office, there were quite a few white girls that lived on some of the estates. They worked with us and we got on and we had our banter. I mean, we always disagreed on the music choices on the radio, but it was fun, right? And the taxi drivers will have, white customers maybe after a night out, and they'll speak to them. And
Yeah, but that's still not the same as working shoulder to shoulder with someone.
Yeah.
It is different.
But the thing is, certain ethnic groups have dominated certain trades, right? And what are we proposing then to change that? Are we proposing that suddenly all the white van man or however you want to term them suddenly become cabbies, or are we saying industries dominated, like a lot of barbers, a lot of good barbers are Kurdish and Turkish, right? And they give you a nice skin fade.
Oh yeah, look, man.
What I'm trying to
if you let like a non-Kurd or a non-Turk touch your hair, that's on you, right? That is on you. But I'm not. I guess I'm not saying like, all right, what you want to do is forcibly integrate like the taxi drivers. The thing I'm saying is that when there is a dearth of other forms of work and forms of work which bring you into contact with other human beings, that's the thing.
Let me give you an example. When I graduated in the middle of COVID, I didn't have a graduate job. I was working 12-hour night shifts in a bread factory in Dunstable. Overwhelmingly, they were all migrant workers, right? They were all recent arrivals. Some of them were African, some of them were Eastern European, some of them were Asian. Very few British-born, including British-born Black and Asian people worked there. They couldn't hack it. It was hard work. Like your feet would be swollen at the end of it, right? And it was through an agency. The conditions were horrible. They treat you like crap. But if you need quick money, we'd say, have you served your time there? Because everyone has a time where they're going through hardship and they do their shifts there. And honestly, I think sometimes it is inevitable that you have that segregation. If you look at who the Deliveroo drivers are, right? Because nobody wants to do that work. You're getting paid peanuts. It's horrible work in the Amazon warehouses. One of the reasons they struggle to organize Amazon workers is because people are constantly leaving, right? And so it's complicated. A lot of Asians become business people because family might have started it and they go into it. They don't go to university. When I was at college, there was a school that was predominantly white working class, and my friend said to me only about 10 of them did A-levels. A lot of them looked at plumbing or other courses. It's almost like a bit of a cultural thing. I genuinely think the best way to tackle this stuff is community initiatives. Like people in communities have to take the initiative to try and create forums where we're talking and we're socializing. And a lot of people are not doing that. They're not socializing in general with their own people. But when there's football leagues, you can do events in a community. I know a guy in one of the estates in Luton, Hockwell Ring. He puts on the football in the community centre and he buys them pizza, and that's his service to the community. He doesn't call himself a lefty or a socialist, but he is. Yeah.
I want to bring it back to the riots, because I saw that you were at the centre of a Twitter controversy. Welcome to my life. And it was about the police. And you had others who were on the left saying, look, you shouldn't be inviting the presence of police, even if it's with the aim of protecting minority communities from racist attacks because the police are themselves racist. And what I saw from your response is you were saying, well, look, I'm not coming in here being like, the thin blue line.
Yeah.
I'm amplifying calls which are coming from these minority communities. So can you tell me a little bit about what your perspective on that is and the role of police in public order situations like the ones we've just seen?
So just to give you a bit of background, when I was 16, I was involved in a campaign called Justice for Leon Briggs, right? Who died in police custody. And I went to the police station and marched outside of it with others in the community. I have been personally impacted by the Prevent agenda as a young Muslim who was giving out Palestine badges and leaflets in school, right? So I'm well aware of, counter-terrorism legislation and the police. I'm writing a book on British South Asian political activism, and a lot of that research looks at the way the police mishandled racism and themselves were perpetuators of racism. I'm well aware of police brutality against the minors and working class people more generally. So I'm not approaching this from a place of ignorance, right? You have to consider here, I'm someone who's barely slept. I'm getting calls from up and down the country from different groups, right? And we are aware on one of the days that there's rumours spreading in Birmingham and Bradford that the EDL are coming, right? EDL doesn't even exist anymore, but that's what's being on Snapchat.
Continuity EDL.
Right, yeah. And all the kids, because I come from these communities, I know what my people are like. They're like, if they come here, we're ready to smash them.
Yeah, we're going to fuck them up.
You know what I mean? And obviously you have to have vigilance and self-defense, and you can't, you can't be complacent, right? I know experienced anti-fascist organisers, right, who said to me, this is a trap. What they are trying to do is they're trying to rile us up, right, get angry and get us into trouble and get us locked up. And if you look at 2001 in Bradford, the Asian kids got very harsh sentences, right? And so I said to myself, look, we are monitoring this situation, right? We are well aware of the fact they're not here. So keep your kids in check, right? Cooperate with the police. And what does that mean? It means if the police say go home, we're dealing with this, go home, we're dealing with this, right? That's all it means. It doesn't mean go there and sing, we love the police, we think you're great, right? We know what happened at Manchester Airport a couple of weeks ago, right? But people on the left, a lot of them are approaching me like I'm some ignorant kid who doesn't know anything about anti-racism or policing or counter-terrorism, right? The other thing to note here, in areas where the Muslim community are few in number, right? I'm talking about hijab-wearing Muslim women in places like Belfast who are absolutely terrified. If you have 30 racist thugs outside your home with weapons, what are you going to do in that situation? Are you going to say, I'm not calling the police because the police are racist? You're going to call the police, and these people will call the police as well. The ones who were criticizing me for that. I've had very productive conversations with people who say, for some communities, we feel as though a police presence doesn't keep us safe. And I said, fine. But I know hijab-wearing Muslim women who fell on that night that because there was a police presence in the northeast and the northwest, and police who were being assaulted, by the way, by the far right, being attacked while they were standing outside refugee centres and things like that, right? You've got to pick your moments, right? You've got to have a bit of nuance and understanding. But instead, what people decided to do was screenshot one tweet as part of a thread. Specifically, in my mind, I was thinking about my brothers in Birmingham and Bradford and Luton, right? And say, no, this is bad. This goes against organising 101, as if there's a book on how to organise, right? This goes against the long-standing traditions of anti-racism and anti-fascism. And I come from Luton. My dad was beaten up by the racists, right? He got chased by the BNP in Bradford. I understand racism. I live it.
I mean, just to, I guess, because you can have good faith disagreements, right? And so I'm not talking about people who are screenshotting your tweet and that, but just to give the example of Amer Walid, who is sentenced to 20 months in prison for throwing cans of beer back at rioters who chucked them at him, Muslim man, while chanting racist abuse. And I think that maybe some of your critics, they'd say, well, this is what happens when you invite police into a situation where you've got minority communities under attack, because the law won't differentiate between self-defense and self-defense under extreme provocation and racist targeting. And, someone like Amer Walid is going to get a really harsh sentence. What would you say to that as a sort of criticism, which is, well, this is a consequence of inviting police into the space.
But the police are problematic. Of course they are. And this is why we are saying to our young people, be careful, because Keir Starmer and his politics is very authoritarian. We know that all the legislation that they're going to pass around, hate speech and all, it will come back to bite trade unionists and minority communities, right? Understanding two things. One, the hostile media environment where they want to depict us as thugs for defending our communities, right? Understanding that the impact that has had on all of this, they have emboldened the far right, the racists in the media. They are looking for an opportunity to depict us a certain way. I have never said don't defend your community or stay at home, right? I've said if there's no far right threat in your community and you've come out, right, and you're tooled up potentially, right? Don't get yourself in trouble. Be smart about it. If there is a far right threat, I'd be there. And I was. On that day, while I was getting death threats, I was out in Luton. I was walking around. I saw old women in hijabs going for a walk in the park because they knew that we were protected, right? And it's about being sensible. And I think the imams of the masjids, in the mosques, right, they had a very sensible approach, a lot of them. Some of them said, don't do anything, stay indoors, right? I've never advocated that. I said, stay vigilant, monitor the far right. If you need to defend yourself, you have to defend yourself. Because in certain scenarios, the police were incapable of doing that, right? So look, that individual has had that sentencing. I think that's wrong, right? I think he's acted in self-defense. And if you study the history of anti-racism, the Bradford 12 case, what did they do? They built petrol bombs, right? And they won by arguing about self-defense and saying the police had failed us on numerous occasions. But again, they had only created those petrol bombs, the Bradford 12. They were going to use it as a deterrent so the far right don't come into the Asian area of Bradford. And they successfully argued the case. If one of them had carried a knife with him and stabbed someone, would they have won that case? No, of course not.
I mean, I want to move on a little bit and talk about the criminal justice response to the rioters. It came out in the news that there was a 15-month sentence for a woman called Julie Sweeney, who posted "Blow the Mosque Up" with the adults in it. There's no evidence that she participated in the rioting. She posted on social media about it. On the flip side, one man, Omar Abdur Razak, he's been charged with inciting unrest for saying, wrongly, that Tommy Robinson instructed his followers to attack mosques. What do you make of the sentencing and the prosecution of individuals for social media posts when they didn't necessarily participate in any unrest themselves?
It's a very tricky one. This is probably one of the most difficult questions because if you are inciting violence, right? When we talk about freedom of speech and absolute freedom of speech, we've always made the case that, the harm principle, right? If you are advocating harm on someone, that is not free speech. That's putting people's lives at risk. So in general, I don't think we should police speech, right? But if you are putting people at harm at a moment like this, then I think you should face repercussions.
Custodial sentences?
I do not have an answer for you. Seriously, I need to really think about this and consider, what is an appropriate response to something like that. I do think that we need to stop people doing it. I do think that social media misinformation is a serious problem. And unfortunately, even some of the Asians, right, they weren't verifying things. Our people are not, the TikTok generation, we get stories and we just share them without thinking it through. And this is a problem in society now. That's very dangerous if we go down a road of, we are going to sentence you because you didn't check the facts. Now, the woman who said we should blow up a mosque or whatever she said, right, that's a clear incitement of violence and she should face consequences. Now, I don't know what that should look like, but I do think under our criminal justice system, someone like that should face consequences. If a Muslim said that, we should go and blow up Big Ben, right?
I'd be in Guantanamo before you can say Jack
So
Robinson.
there you go. So let's have some consistency around that, because what I understand from our criminal justice system is the police intelligence around the far right threat has failed. They have not taken the far right threat seriously.
Because they're instructed by the Conservatives not to.
Exactly, and that's a serious problem. They had no intelligence. We were in Telegram groups and saying, we've just heard that they might be heading up to this place, right? The police need to be on top of this. They're supposed to have the most accurate intelligence. Because this is, why aren't we classifying it as terrorism when you are trying to incite fear in a minority community to achieve a political goal? In my eyes, is a form of terrorism. No? When you are attacking innocent people, you are desecrating graves, you are, burning businesses. Why is it that when it comes to people who are not Muslim, suddenly it's all legitimate concerns?
Well, all right. So here's the thing, which is I obviously agree with you that there's a huge gap in policing when it comes to the far right. Absolutely massive. And I agree with you. But I'm not sure if the answer is to take the worst aspects of counter-terror policing, which targeted Muslims, and say, okay, now we're going to apply it to the far right. Because that whole rubric of non-violent extremism and creating this really big net, right? And a very selectively applied net as well about what counts as non-violent extremism. That's exactly what helped target you when you were a student and you were, handing out pro-Palestine
what I'm trying to
leaflets
say
at school.
is, there's clearly an inconsistency there, right?
I agree with you on the inconsistency, but it's the what to do about it.
I don't think we need a prevent for the far right, by the way. I think prevent is a flawed program. It doesn't keep communities safer, right? I do think, though, that the individuals who are radicalizing these youngsters, right, they are a problem. Now, how do you tackle a problem like Elon Musk, for instance, who runs Twitter, who's been spreading a lot of this, who's been amplifying a lot of this hate, right? That, for me, is one of the biggest problems at the moment. It's social media misinformation.
Do you agree with the online safety bill that's coming through?
I need to look into it in more detail before I make a comment on it. But I think in general, when we talk about the far right threat in this country, we need to at least monitor it. We can discuss what the response looks like, but we're not even on the point of monitoring it properly, understanding who are these neo-Nazis and patriotic alternative people spreading misinformation. What's the role of potential actors from outside the UK? That's been something a lot of people are talking about. And if you go on Twitter, you see all these people with blue ticks, right? And then and giving you racist abuse and they're not from Britain, right? That's a serious problem. So what I'm trying to say is, the same way that the state talks about harsher sentencing and cracking down on these people, you have to understand the causes. You have to tackle social media misinformation. You have to figure out a way to get to grips with these people inciting violence, right? And hatred. And I think we're not doing enough of that approach.
Taj Ali, thank you so much for joining us.